Greetings. My name is Marvin Arce. I am representing Emma, and welcome to my signature assignment. The events that took place at the Hot Spoon and Driscoll involving my client Emma, Mr. Jones, Mrs. Potts, and a dog named Horton has evolved into a confusing and painful ordeal for everyone involved. Emma, having brought her dog Horton to the Hot Spoon to enjoy the play area for dogs while she enjoyed a delicious meal, did not expect what would happen as she sat in the restaurant. As she enjoyed a steaming bowl of clam chowder, she was surprised to hear a crash and looked to see Mrs. Potts slipping on a wet floor, waving her arms in an attempt to keep her balance. Mrs. Potts fell onto the table where Emma was seated and spilled all of the hot clam chowder onto Emma, burning her body immediately. Emma's dog Horton heard the loud crash and jumped to Emma's rescue. Horton was able to leap over the dog's enclosure fence and was able to reach Mrs. Potts and bit her on her derriere. Emma suffered second-degree burns over 15% of her body, and Mrs. Potts suffered a broken finger and a dog bite. Per Driscoll Town Ordinance 1-0012, quote, all restaurants electing to have dedicated play areas for the pets owned by patrons shall have a barrier constructed along the length of said enclosure of a height not less than 3 feet and not greater than 6 feet. Clearly, the pet enclosure fence that Mr. Jones had installed was 2 inches short of 3 feet at 2 foot 10 inches. Mr. Jones also failed to place a wet floor warning sign after having the floors cleaned that afternoon. My initial client interview with Emma would be focused on gaining her trust and taking whatever negative traumatic experience she is still harboring after the event and turning into an opportunity to share information with me so that I can help represent her. Negotiation with the opposing parties would be approached with the understanding that Mrs. Potts accidentally slipped and fell, not intending to do harm to Emma. I would also establish that Emma was not responsible for his dog's ability to jump the inadequately constructed fence and then biting Mrs. Potts. The negotiation would hinge on Mrs. Potts and Emma realizing that Mr. Jones and his restaurant staff's negligence led to the accident that caused harm to both ladies. Mediation would be held with Mrs. Potts and Emma's best interests at heart. I would try to get the two parties to come to terms with each other and place the blame for the incident where it belonged, in Mr. Jones's hands. I would express to the arbitrator that everything that transpired that afternoon could have been avoided by Mr. Jones and his restaurant employees by simply following the town ordinance regarding the fence and by placing a warning sign above the wet floor. Now, interviewing Emma would include, first of all, assuring her that I would do what it takes to make sure that she does not suffer from this event any further than she already has. Calming her and gaining her trust. Gathering information that is relevant to the case while also learning her perspective to best be able to help her. Preparation for negotiation with Mrs. Potts and Mr. Jones includes providing the Driscoll Town Ordinance that states, quote, all restaurants electing to have dedicated play areas for the pets owned by patrons shall have a barrier constructed along the length of said enclosure of a height not less than 3 feet and not greater than 6 feet. Mr. Jones failed to abide by this town ordinance, as well as failing to place a wet floor caution sign after having the restaurant floor mopped. It is my belief that the failure of Mr. Jones to abide by the ordinance and to ensure the safety of his patrons by placing a wet floor sign directly led to Mrs. Potts slipping on the floor, landing on Emma's table, burning Emma, and subsequently the dog leaping over the fence that was too short to bite Mrs. Potts. This whole evolution could have been prevented by Mr. Jones and his restaurant staff had they been adhering to the rules and regulations of a respectable restaurant. I developed my negotiation strategy for Mr. Jones by establishing his liability for failing to prevent the event. My strategy for negotiating with Mrs. Potts is dependent on Mrs. Potts agreeing that it was Mr. Jones' negligence as a restaurant owner and not Emma's negligence as a dog owner that led to her injuries. Mediation between Emma and Mr. Jones is much more aggressive as we know that he is at fault. I would seek that he admit guilt and prepare to make amends to Emma and Mrs. Potts for his role in creating the circumstances that led to both of the ladies' injuries. Mediation between Emma and Mrs. Potts will be focused on getting them both to work together to bring Mr. Jones to justice. After all, it was Mr. Jones who decided to save the money by not creating a 3-foot enclosure fence. 2 inches short of the 3 feet that are mandated by the town ordinance is not adequate as prescribed in the ordinance. This is why Horton was able to leap the fence without much effort, especially after hearing his owner screaming in pain, coming to her rescue, not knowing what was going on as he is just a dog, and biting Mrs. Potts, causing her injury. I have prepared to present to the arbitrator all of the evidence of negligence by Mr. Jones that led to the events. All the way back to before the events happened, when he created the enclosure fence and decided to cut corners and decided not to build it at the prescribed height of 3 feet, opting to go for a 2-foot and 10-inch fence. I would appeal to the arbitrator on Emma's behalf to prove that she is not negligent as a dog owner because she had not trained her dog to be violent or to attack or to be anything other than just her pet. Now, as we all know, pets are very attached to their owners, and Horton was acting out of fear that Emma was in true danger as he heard her scream in pain from the clam chowder that burned her skin. Emma is not negligent, and her dog was simply protecting her as he thought she was in danger. The outcome for the case is that Mr. Jones be held liable for the damages suffered by Emma and Mrs. Potts. Mrs. Potts has filed a complaint against Emma, saying that Emma has negligently refused to properly supervise her pet, which resulted in the release and subsequent attack on the person of plaintiff Mrs. Potts, causing grievous injury to said derriere of the plaintiff. So Mrs. Potts is coming after Emma for the damages that she sustained after a chain of events that was started by a wet floor sign not being placed where there was a wet floor in Mr. Jones's restaurant. I believe this to be a direct result of his employees not having proper training in providing for the safety of all of the patrons in the restaurant at all times. It is common knowledge that when there's a wet floor, people may easily slip and hurt themselves. These are things, liabilities that restaurants and other businesses mitigate by placing placards or signs or cones and things of that nature. Mr. Jones and his staff failing to do so is what directly contributed to Mrs. Potts slipping in the first place, setting off the chain of events. We ask that Mr. Jones be held liable for the damages suffered by Mrs. Potts and not Emma, as well as the damages suffered by Emma, and that he build an enclosure that is at least 3 feet tall, rectifying his mistake, and that he train his employees, emphasizing safety and hazard mitigation. We also seek damages of $200,000 for Emma under the theory of joint and several liability. Thank you.